I'm Celeste Scott. I'm the UT Extension Horticulture Agent in Madison County, and I welcome everybody to this session, Growing a Cut Flower Garden. Now, this is, I think, our fourth or fifth class in the Gardener's Toolshed series. So if you're not familiar with this learning series, go to MadisonCountyMG.org and you will be able to access our full calendar. So we've got classes scheduled all through 2021 on a variety of different topics. Let's see, a few weeks ago we did direct seeding in the home vegetable garden. Today we're going over cut flowers. Here in another week and a half or so, we're going to talk about crepe myrtle bark skill. I know that crepe myrtles are leafing out and people are beginning to notice that black sooty mold on their branches. So we're going to talk about control of bark skill, and the list just goes on and on. We're going to have lots of great sessions. So be sure to go to the website and check that out. Of course, for these lunch and learns, you can access them via Zoom. There will be a password, so you'll register for the class. Those who are with us today know how that works. But for those who are watching this streamed over Facebook, of course, we do try to stream each of these live. And if you miss those, you can always go back to our website, MadisonCountyMG.org, and I post links to all of the recorded sessions there. So if you find that you want to catch up on some that we've already done, you can always go there and catch up. So I was so excited. I've been having a lot of questions last year about cut flowers and how to get started. And I love, love, love cut flowers and try to always dedicate an area in my garden to growing just for cut flowers, because while I have lots of things mixed into my perennial borders and my landscaping around the house that have beautiful blooms, sometimes I just cannot bring myself to cut those flowers off. I mean, they are gorgeous and, are gorgeous in bouquets. And you can see in this arrangement here, I did this last year, but it was actually about this same time because my peonies are in full bloom, as are many of my irises and bachelor buttons as well. But it's hard for me to go out there and cut those blooms off. But if I have a designated area where I know I'm going to grow flowers that are dedicated to me cutting them to make arrangements for inside my home and to share with others, it makes things a lot easier. So we are going to try to, in the next 30 minutes, briefly discuss cut flowers from start to finish. Some of the highlights that I want to point out will be choosing site. Then we get to choose flowers, right? Planting and maintaining, that's a big issue. Harvesting, and then, of course, arranging and enjoying those. And we will have a follow-up session to this session. Let me look in my calendar here. On July 19th, we have one of our Gardener's Toolshed classes is on cut flower arrangement. So hopefully my cut flower garden will be far enough along that we'll be able to have some material to work with, and I will get someone here to do some good video for us, and we'll talk about arranging flowers from our gardens. So the first thing I want to point out is site. Okay, so most of our flowering annuals that we're growing from seed in these designated cut flower gardens are going to require at least 6 hours of direct light each day in order to flower well. Now, I'm not saying this is all, but the majority, right, of the ones that are easiest to grow that are annuals will need full sun. This is a shot of part of my cut flower garden in my garden, and this area is on the, let's see, east side of my, I'm thinking it's on the south. It's on the south side of my home. So it gets full exposure to sun. Now you can tell how flat this lawn area is here. Our property here was carved out of one of my dad's cotton fields. So we don't have any mature trees to provide much sunlight. So any reprieve that this area might get would be shade from the house. But in summer, it has none because it is located there on the east side of the house, southeast side of the house, and it gets full exposure to sun, so plenty of sunlight. Also, you want to make sure that you have good drainage. This does not need to be an area that collects moisture and holds moisture, and it is on a slight grade. I don't know if you can, I tried to put a picture in there where you could see that there was grade, but there definitely is grade in this area. Another important thing you need to think about is access to water. Do not locate your cutting garden so far away from a water source that you wouldn't be able to provide water when we get into those droughty months of the summer. We're talking like the end of July and 1st of August, because if you're like me and sometimes procrastinate on getting these seeds in the ground or getting my transplant started so I can get them in the ground, sometimes my major bloom periods don't even start until July, right? So we want to make sure that we can get water to them if needed. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about water and maintenance, so I'll mention it here. Watering from beneath is preferred. As compared to overhead watering, because that can leave moisture on the leaves. If you have them planted thickly, which most people do in these types of situations, they want to get as many plants packed into that area as they can. Sometimes we don't have adequate airflow, and so watering from overhead could slow down drying of those leaves. So if you do need to water, let's keep overhead watering to a minimum, and maybe have some kind of backup system in place, maybe like soaker hoses that run up and down the rows, or possibly drip irrigation if you are going to grow under plastic. So now, after we found a decent site, somewhere that has good light exposure, has adequate drainage, and is located near a water source, now we get to talk about the flowers. So the possibilities are endless. This is my favorite part, right? So in the winter months when I haven't been able to be outside and there's not much going on in my garden, I get out the seed catalogs, and sometimes I go a bit crazy. I will have to say I'm guilty of it. I overbuy seeds because I just cannot decide exactly what I want in the heat of the moment. And so I usually just get all of them. But again, if you have limited space, this is something to keep in mind. So I am going to point out some things that we need to look for in our flowers, since we may have that limited space and are going to have to make some hard decisions, right, on what we want to grow. Because in the end, I don't want you to end up with all like plants that just have like big flowers, right? Because an interesting arrangement needs an assortment of interesting floral blooms, foliage, some texture, some accent, right? You want these things to mix together to make a beautiful arrangement. And if you only plant zinnias, I take that back. An arrangement of just zinnias can be beautiful by itself, but less interesting. So I want to make sure that you end up with a good selection of different types of flowering plants to create your beautiful arrangements. And the pictures that y'all are looking at here are just some shots out of my garden from last year. Some of my favorites. I love those Julie pinky purple tones of that one there in the top center. And then last year I grew a lot of the cactus type varieties. Those are these on the right over here that are kind of frilly. Another favorite of mine is the peppermint series. So any of the ones that have those streaks in them, or some people call them candy canes. And green zinnias. I love those lime green zinnias as well. So just wanted to put a few in there. So now let's get into some things that we need to consider when we are selecting our flowers. So in our cut flower area, our dedicated cut flower garden, do we want these to all be annuals? So plants that we have to replant every year. Okay, and we're planting them in an orderly fashion. Or do we want this area to be dedicated to perennial cut flowers? So for instance, let's say peonies. I have some peonies mixed into my landscaping. I do cut on them and bring them inside, but you might want an entire row of peonies. And in that case, we need to take that into account when you're laying out your garden plan, because those are going to stay there. You're not going to be disturbing that area year after year. So we'll need to be thinking long-term about, weed control and plant placement and plant support and some of these other things that we'll talk about a little later. Next thing to consider is, are these warm season or cool season? So bachelor buttons, I love bachelor buttons. They're in full bloom in my garden now. I don't designate an area for them in my cut flower garden because I like to have them sprinkled throughout my throughout my landscape there, and I just kind of let them reseed and come up freely. But if you wanted to have a large supply of bachelor button, that's going to be important. We're going to need to designate a certain area of our garden to these flowers that are more well suited to cooler conditions. Another one would be larkspur. I love larkspur, and it will bloom, on throughout the summer, and you could try to control that with some succession plantings. But for the most part, they're in full bloom right now. So annuals or perennials, or even are they bulbs, right? So I love gladiolus. You might want to have an entire row of gladiolus. So if these are things that we're going to be leaving in the ground from year to year, or you could treat gladiolus as an annual and just pull those corms up at the end of the season and start fresh with new. So all things to consider. Next thing that I would recommend that you think about is, are they branching, or do they bloom on a single stem? So for instance, many of our sunflowers are single stemmed. They grow one terminal bud and they have one bloom at the top. When you cut that flower, that space that you dedicated to that plant is now free. You can feel free to pull that plant up because you will not get another good quality cut from that single stemmed sunflower in that season. So if you are wanting to do sunflowers but have a larger volume of blooms per plant harvested, let's look for some varieties that are branching. Zinnias by nature are branching. So just, I'm trying to provide some examples for those who may not be too familiar. Next thing that I would urge you to think about when you're laying out your garden is the height of your plants. We want to make sure that they are not, depending on how your garden is positioned, that they're not going to be shading out any of the smaller plants that you may have in that garden. And this is an ideal situation, but mine is located on the south side of my house, so it doesn't really matter what order I plant plants as far as height goes, because I'm planting them in a north-south orientation, and they are in full sun for literally every hour of the day. So these plants are getting adequate exposure. So just some things I would like you to consider when you're in your planting stages. The next thing that I wanted to mention is, are these plants that you're wanting to grow easy to germinate? Okay. Do they prefer being directly seeded in the garden, or do they do better if we start them indoors and then transplant them outside? So I'm going to give you some examples. Like zinnias are really, really tough. You can plant them directly in the ground. You do not have to start them indoors. However, if you wanted to get an early jump on the season, you could start some zinnia seed inside before we have our last frost. And then, like now, our chances of frost pretty much essentially have passed. We're at like the 99% average that we're not going to have another frost. You could feel safe to go ahead and put those transplants out, and also go ahead and immediately plant some seeds. And then again, in about 3 more weeks, plant another batch of seeds. And that way you're going to have a nice succession of harvest. And another thing is, many of our zinnias are susceptible to powdery mildew and really ugly leaf spots. And that's not a huge deal because it doesn't generally affect the blossom, just the foliage, and we're stripping that foliage off anyway. But it can make your garden look real ratty. So if you have those successions of plantings, you can discard those older, more diseased plants as you go along. So thinking about if they're direct seeding, I'm trying to think of some other things that we might want to mention about that. Cosmos are super, super easy to start direct seeded in the ground. Tithonia, well, I have some pictures. Let me just move on over here and you can see the pictures of these. Here we go. So I've got a few different shots of cosmos. There's tons and tons of varieties of cultivars out there, but these are just some that I grew last year. I really like seashells. I think that's what this one here is on the bottom left. You can see how that bloom there in the center is cupped all the way around, and it's shaped kind of like a conch seashell, one you would blow into or put up to your ear. So those are beautiful. Another favorite of mine, and these are all annuals, things that you'd be planting over and over again every year. This is a Cosmo as well, but this is Cosmo sulphureus. This is has a different growth habit. It's a bit taller, it branches more, and you can tell that the flower is distinct, has a distinct difference from your typical Cosmos. And then another that I always love to have in the cut flower garden, not only for its beautiful orange bloom here, but for its foliage, is Tithonia, or the Mexican sunflower, some people call it. It's multi-branched, so you get lots of cuts per plant. The stem is like fuzzy, and the leaves have a nice texture to them as well. So I really like to have those in arrangements, even if it doesn't have many blooms on that particular cut, just because the stems and the foliage are so interesting. So lots of things to consider. And we talked about succession planting already. You can certainly do that with all of these plants. Have 2 or 3 plantings that are spaced out, and you will get blooms well into the fall. All of these were started kind of late. I didn't actually plant any of my cut flowers last year till about the end of May. So I did not get many cuts until we got well into July, and they bloomed all the way up until frost. And some after the frost. The tops of some of the plants protected the underneath buds from the frost. So I got a few after we even had our first frost. Also, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat, and then I'll cover them all at the end, okay? So we've covered a lot of the major points that I would like, for people to consider when we're trying to plan out our cut flower gardens. But I've been focusing mainly on annuals, things that we would grow from seed each year. I don't want to discount the fact that the majority actually, of our perennials that we're using in the landscape are excellent cut flowers and will hold up and have really nice vase lives indoors as well. So this top left picture here, that's Baptisia. It should be coming into bloom right now if it's not in full bloom already. Cone flowers are excellent and have a very, very long vase life, as do, Rudbeckia here in the bottom left, and Shasta daisies right above them there. Oh, and then you can even see I have some gladiolus poking up behind that cone flower there. I don't generally put my dedicate a row to gladiolus in the cut flower garden because I have a really limited area. So I try to incorporate everything that I can into my landscaped beds so that I can then grow the things that are a little wilder, or the things that I want more of dedicated in that cut flower area. So as best you can, try to mix things up, and then you'll get the best of both worlds. So we've talked about annuals, we've talked about perennials. Then this is an annual as well. This is Nigella. But I wanted to stress the importance of having plants that can act as fillers. So these other plants we've been looking at so far, really we're valuing them mainly for their floral bloom, right, that they're attributing to the arrangement, their color, their shape, their form. But to have a really nice, even arrangement, I'll say, fillers are so important. And this is one of those perfect little plants that can certainly fit the bill. Not only are their blooms gorgeous and their foliage has this really nice ferny texture, but I would value them maybe even more than for their bloom. I would go ahead and let them mature, and you can see a pod down, a couple pods down here on the bottom right-hand corner. These pods are gorgeous and will last for a long, long time in a vase, much longer than say would the bloom if you had cut it to add it to the bloom. But that really just cool, unique seed pod is going to add a lot of texture and interest. Could maybe even use those as accents and are great for drying. So be sure if you are interested in drying that you include plenty of plants in plenty of space in your cut flower garden for some of these plants that lend themselves well to drying, like status can do well here. Straw flowers. Oh, here's my packet. I haven't got them planted yet. Straw flowers. Here's some status. Let's see. Ooh, gomphrena, or people call it bachelor's buttons. So those do really, really well when dried. Some types of celosia can be dried, but I didn't want us to miss out on that. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about foliage. So, you know, we need fillers, we need accent, but we also need some foliage in these designs. And this is really where I lean more heavily on my landscaped beds, my perennial borders that I already have. You know, I can go out there, cut a few stems of some interesting foliage and really make those flowers that I've dedicated to my cut flower garden pop. So I believe this is probably some foliage of Solomon's seal. And then, oh, this sweet little flower, you can grow these in your cut flower garden, or I just let them sprinkle and come up in my borders. This is called Orlea. So it is reminiscent of a Queen Anne's lace, but the blooms are bigger, and you can tell the ones here along the outside are much larger, kind of reminiscent of a butterfly, and it has a really ferny foliage too. So this plant can serve you well in the foliage area and in the filler aspect. And some people confuse it with Dara. It's similar. I want to show you so you don't get confused. Dara actually is in the same genus and species as Queen Anne's lace, so Daucus carota, and it comes in a multitude of shades. So like white, cream, some purpley and pink kind of colors. And some people call it Amy, but this is Orlea. So a different species there, Orlea grandiflora. But both would do well in cut gardens here in our area. And then to wrap up all these different types of flowers we need to keep into consideration, do not overlook woody plants. So while I, for my home cutting garden, would probably not plant an entire row of hydrangea, I can certainly lean heavily on the blooms produced by various hydrangea that I have in the garden. This is arborescens hydrangea. I'm trying to think. It's not Annabelle. It's the one that's supposed to be bigger than that. I can't think of the name at the moment. But certainly, you know, use these woody plants for interesting cuts. Use some use plants that are cherished for their berries. Beautyberry, once those berries have started forming, those come on right at the end of summer, and they can make beautiful arrangements with zinnias, adding that pop of color and texture to some of those more bold colored cuts that we have in the garden at that time of year. And then I wanted to point out here on the top left over here, I've got verbena, or stick verbena, or tall verbena, some people call it, but Verbena bonariensis. And it is just gorgeous. And it is great for adding, you know, texture and a little accent and some height sometimes to arrangements. When we've got so many large clustered flowers here at the bottom and we need something to really create a little height, that stick verbena can certainly do that. And I had some those little daisies, that is actually just a weed. It's called fleabane daisy. But I thought it would be really pretty mixed with that verbena there, so I let it grow, and I did cut that down before it went to seed because I certainly didn't want that coming up everywhere, but it really made a nice little combination, if you will. So now now that we've kind kind of covered all of our bases about, plants and all these different things to consider when we're trying to pick out what's going to work best for us in our cut garden. Now we need to talk a little bit about how to get ready to plant those. So this is my small little area. It's nothing, fancy, but I tilled this about a week ago. It's pretty wet outside. I ran outside and took this snap this morning so you can see how it looks a little muddy. You definitely don't want to work in your garden when it's muddy. Like, do not try to go out there and till your garden up right now. Let's let it air out so that we don't destroy the structure in our soils that we have there. But you can see on the left side, I have a bunch of crimson clover over here that was planted over this entire area. I used that as a cover crop at the end of last season. When we got our first frost, I pulled everything out and I seeded red crimson clover over it just to have something growing through the winter and to discourage cool season weeds from coming up, right? Like henbit and all this other shepherd's purse and things like that. And it really, really served its purpose, but it's time for me to get ready to plant our plants. And technically I probably could have planted directly into that clover cover. But I really didn't want to allow for that competition. So the clover would be, taking moisture and nutrients from the soil that I really want to dedicate to my cut flowers. So this year I went ahead and I mowed it first. I mowed it very, very close. I let it lay there for about a week and let it start doing its decomposition. And then I came in with my tiller and I used it as a green manure and I just tilled it right in. And you can also see there's still these lines where I have these darker lines. That's actually the mulch that was left over that I used to cover my middles, like my little walkways that I had through my rows to harvest my cut flowers. And so, it's decomposed as well all throughout the winter. And I went ahead and turned that in. And this year I'll probably plant into those darker areas and allow those lighter areas to be my walking paths. And that way we're just continually building up organic matter and enriching that soil. I'm not saying you have to do it that way. I'm just saying it's the way I decided to do mine. But no matter what path you decide to take as far as cultivation, you need to start with clean ground, whether you used Roundup to kill everything that's there, whether you use tillage to get rid of existing vegetation, or you just went out there and hand weeded. We really need to especially get grass killed out of that area that we're going to be planting into. And then there are some other things that we need to think about. So, before we start planting, do our beds need to meet any specific specifications, right, for various maintenance systems? So do you think if you're having a large planting and do you think you're going to need to be able to fit your tiller down your middles at any point in time? If so, you need to make sure you make your walking middles as wide as your tiller is, because you certainly don't want to disturb the roots of any of your cut flowers that are growing in your designated rows. So a few other things. Do you think that you will ever use low tunnels over your rows? There are several reasons you might want to do this. As demonstrated in this picture, you could use those arches to hold your floral support netting. You could also use those hoops to drape shade cloths over when we get into those hot summer months. If you have a plant that really prefers a bit more shade, that might be something to consider. Or you might be trying to start some of your annuals super early in the ground. And in those type of situations, you could use those hoops to cover with plastic and create a little warmer environment and help to speed up the warming of the soil in those areas. So if you anticipate using low tunnel hoops at any point in time, before you get your beds prepared, make sure you know what the width of those hoops are so that you can plan accordingly. Another thing to consider is what types of mulch do you plan to use? And this really isn't an option. You need to use some kind of mulch, whether it's an organic mulch like wheat straw or bark mulch. Maybe you decide to use a biodegradable mulch, something like, cardboard pieces in your walkways or newspapers in your planting, in your planting area where you can easily make holes and get those plants down into the ground. Or you might opt to use some type of landscape fabric, or even plastic cover, which you can see here in this picture. They've decided to use that plastic over the entire area. They used it in their planting rows and for their walkways. And word to the wise, if you decide to use plastic, something that's impermeable, you will have to have drip irrigation installed underneath that for your plants, because any water that comes down is going to roll off. So just several things to keep in mind when we're trying to plan how wide and how long to make our rows. And then the final thing that I would stress for you to kind of do a little thinking on is plant spacing. Obviously, if you have no idea, follow whatever is on your seed packets there for plant spacing. But I will say sometimes I try to hedge that and I plant a little closer than recommended, because if I have a thicker stand, they'll help each other to stand up, basically. If there's too much space in between them and a big wind comes over, they all fall over. If they're planted a bit closer and a wind comes through, the outside one might fall over, but these other ones are stacked up pretty good against it. So that's just from a personal experience, and they kind of act like a scaffolding if you can get them planted a little more densely. But you don't want to plant them too thick, because then we'll have issues with disease. So if you're new to it, just start with the basics and experiment from there to find out what your personal preferences are and what will work in your specific setting. Oh, and this is a little picture. These are so here's a few zinnia on this outside area. These right here with these kind of ferny foliage, that is Cosmos sulphureus, that orange one. And then you can see the real fringy plants up front. That is just a standard Cosmos. These are things that reseeded themselves in that garden plot. And before I tilled it, well, actually, before I mowed it, I went and got my shovel and I just dug them up and set them aside and watered them for a day or two until we could get that plot worked up. And once I got it tilled, I came back in and went ahead and planted them. And I had a leftover bale of wheat straw. I was using a bale of wheat straw to kind of insulate a fig tree that's close to there from the snow and all that. And it was starting to come on out. And so I took that wheat straw and just kind of spread it across here to try to discourage any weed growth while I get ready to direct seed the rest of my plants. So we've talked about planting, and now I want to mention a few things about maintenance, and then we'll try to wrap things up. But planting, of course, is easy enough, but it's the maintenance that really requires attention to detail. So I already mentioned, be sure we've got to utilize mulches in some form or fashion to reduce that weed pressure. It is, you won't believe it, but it is so hard to hoe around tender transplants and newly germinated seedlings. You just don't want to do it. So we need to for sure try to instill some method of mulching. Irrigation, we've talked about this already. Avoid overhead irrigation. Try to have something else in place, maybe soaker hoses or a basic drip irrigation system that we could lay down in betwixt those rows. And if you use plastic, you will have to have drip irrigation. Just know this. If you have plastic over your planting area, you will have to have drip irrigation. But one thing we haven't talked about is support. And you may be thinking, well, I mean, I could probably do without that, right? And the answer is yes. You do not have to have plant support. But if you would like really strong, straight stems and keep your garden in a very orderly fashion, this is the way to go. Last year, I did not use netting, and we had a big rainstorm that had a lot of wind, and nearly everything got blown over, right? I mean, not everything. The outside rows fell all the way down. Everything else just kind of had a lean to it. And so as those flowers developed, they had a curve to their stems because they were trying to grow towards the sun. Some of the plants righted themselves, some did not. But when we have that, movement of the plants, those buds are naturally going to move towards the sun, and so you'll end up with crooked stems, and it can make floral arranging a little more difficult. It can make it look more natural and free, though, and that might be what you want. And in that case, don't use netting. But support netting can be really great. So generally, support netting has 6 by 6 inch openings, and the rows it comes in a roll that's 3 feet wide, but it's super easy to cut that down. So if you only want your rows to be 2 feet in width or 1.5 feet in width, or whatever you choose, it'll be very, very simple for you just to go ahead and make that fit your particular situation. It comes on rolls of various lengths. They can get anywhere from 20 feet to 100 feet. And like I said, just cut it, and you can do multiple short rows with a 100-foot row. You can have 10-foot rows. A few other things to think about is that the good thing about this, it's plastic. It's like a plastic mesh, and you can reuse it from year to year because it is not phytodegradable. The sun does not harm it at all. So at the end of the season, you take out your crop and you roll your netting up. You put a little note on it that says, this is a 10-foot long roll, right? That's 2 foot wide, or however you condition that to make it appropriate for your garden. And you can use that over and over and over. Now, if you don't have that big of a space, say that maybe you're gardening in a raised bed, or you only have, a few rows and you don't want to do the expense of the netting. There is another method called corralling, and I don't have a picture of it, but you can imagine, hopefully you can imagine what I'm describing. So say you have a 4 by 8 foot raised bed. You'll put a pretty sturdy post in each corner. You want it, pretty sturdy. You don't want anything to be able to move this. So you need to get it way down in there in the ground. Then you're going to take a twine and go up about 2 feet, and you're going to wrap it around the first corner post. And then you're going to go from post to post, wrapping it around each time. And when you come back to the beginning, tie it off. And so you'll end up with, a corral, if you will, all the way around that main planting. Then you would go up again about a foot from that first layer and make another layer around. And so now you've got 2. Now, depending on how tall these plants are going to get will depend on how many levels you need to add. You don't really want to get above half of the mature height. So if the plant is only going to get 5 feet tall, you only need 2 layers, right? So you'd have one at 2 foot and then another one there at 3 foot. You wouldn't want to do another at 4 foot because that would make it hard to harvest your flowers. So, and then once you have that done, if the plants start growing and that you see they need a little more stability, maybe like within that 4 foot span, you could use twine to do some cross bracing, right? Go from this corner to the opposite corner, this corner to the opposite corner, and do some crossing like that, just to give a little extra support. And then finally, harvesting. So, harvest times vary widely for all different types of cut flowers. There's no way that we could go over that today, but I do have a nice document that is from, I got this document. I joined a group on Facebook. It is called, what's that group called? Grow Flowers. I think that's what it's called. And it's a group that's dedicated to people who like cut flowers and who are growing them either in their home garden or on the small scale for selling. And one of the folks on there used they cross-referenced some reliable flower cut flower garden resources and compiled some of the most common cut flowers and their specifics into this chart. So I'm happy to provide that to everybody who is attending the class today. And it is super, super helpful, and it will help you know when you need to harvest particular types of flowers. I mean, it can be anywhere from bud stage to half open to 80% to fully open. And it's really important because when you harvest these, depends on the length of the vase life. If you don't harvest it at the appropriate time, it won't last as long as it could have if you had harvested it at the appropriate time in its development. And that has to do with sugars and carbohydrates moving through the plant and getting to those blooms. Sometimes if we harvest them too early, the buds will never open because there wasn't enough sugar left in that cut stem to provide to those blooms. So very important aspect is to know when the best time, when should you harvest flowers so that you get the longest vase life after them. And that group is called Grow Flowers. I just looked it up on my phone here. I couldn't remember. Grow Flowers, if you're interested in being in a group with others who are interested in cut flowers. Another excellent resource that I use all the time is this book. It is called Specialty Cut Flowers, and it is by Alan Armitage and a lady, I think Susan Loshman. I don't remember her first name. Let me look. Oh, Judy Loshman. And this book is awesome. I'm going to just tell you here. It has a lot of information at the beginning about cultivation of flowers, but then it goes through flowers in alphabetical order and in detail tells you what these plants need for best cultivation in a cut flower garden. So for example, for larkspur or consolida is the Latin name for that. It goes through some basics of growing it, what you can use it for, the differences in some of the more common species. It talks about propagation. Most cultivars are direct sown in the field. It talks about how many seeds you need to plant specific row lengths. It gives specifics on germination, soil temperature, stratification, chilling of the seed before you plant it, that's what stratification is. It'll mention scarification if the seeds need to be scarred before you try to plant them. What else does it talk about? It talks about fertility. It talks about all different types of environmental factors that could affect it. Field performance, talks about planting times, and covers many different areas of the country. So this book wasn't written from a specific locale perspective. It was written so that no matter where you are in the United States, this could be applicable to you. Talks about greenhouse performance, also high tunnel performance, and stages of harvest, post-harvest care, and then goes on to list many of the desirable cultivars and even pests and diseases. So much information on every type, not every, but many types of popular cut flowers. So specialty cut flowers, Alan Armitage and Judy Loshman. That will be a great resource to you. And so we don't have much time here left today to talk about post-harvest handling, but that is okay because when we have our arrangement class, I think that would be the perfect opportunity for us to talk about harvest techniques, post-harvest handling, floral preservatives, and then also just, the art of arranging. So these are a couple little teacup pair arrangements that I made last year to take to a little garden club event that we had. You can tell I've used, a lot of things from the cut flower garden. I used zinnias, but I used things that weren't from there as well. So I have a perennial lantana, ham and eggs. I had beautyberry in there. I used some, that's not Dusty Miller, it's actually Artemisia, the silver mound Artemisia or silver king, I can't remember. So just try to mix things up and make things interesting. I think I've included a few others. This arrangement was a few days old. You can tell from the the petals there on my coneflower, but I just wanted to take a picture of it because I thought it was so beautiful. I pinched some coleus out of some mixed pots that I had here. I used some salvia lucante that, well, no, this was a mealy cut type sage. Celosia is beautiful in arrangements and can easily be added to your cut flower garden, your designated cut flower garden. So just some fun ideas on things that you could do. And this resource page has some great information on it. And again, I'm happy to provide this to anybody who'd like it. Before I let you go, I certainly want to point out that you need to visit uthort.com if you haven't already been there. When you go to uthort.com, this is the site where we house all of our horticulture information from the University of Tennessee. You can go up into the search box on the top right-hand corner and just type in a phrase like direct sow or seed grown in there. And this publication will pop up. It's seed grown annuals in the home garden. And this publication is an all-inclusive list of plants that perform well in home gardens in Tennessee and are easy to grow from seed. The key there is easy. We did not include things that were hard to grow from seed. So there's lots of stuff that we could grow, but we wanted to point those things out that would be easiest for people to start with. And this would be a great resource for you to reference as you're planning out what to plant in your cut flower gardens. All right, well, I thank you all for attending, and I cannot wait to see you again on May 24th. We'll be talking about crepe myrtle bark scale and how to control that in the landscape. Okay, thanks y'all. Bye.